Good evening. Thank you, Maya. Thank you, Amanda. It's hard for me to connect with you at the level you are connected there, but I'll do my best. I am speaking to you from Portland, Maine. It's 9 p.m., almost 9 p.m. right now in Maine, and I see you had a great dinner. It looks like I really feel so bad for not having been able to join you. I tried many ways to come. I tried with several airlines, and both our hosts, Maya and Amanda, tried their best. Unfortunately, southern tornadoes or whatever winds prevented me from reaching you in Lafayette. I hear it's great food, Cajun food, and a lot to celebrate in that region. So I apologize for not being able to be with you in person. When I was invited and when I was given the honor to speaking to you, I kept thinking about how best to address this meeting. And the more I thought about this presentation, the more I realized that we are living at a time when some of the topics and some of the issues I raised in my book, We Are All Moors, apply very much today, especially in light of recent political developments, both in the United States and also in Europe. And I think there is no better way to address these issues than for me to remind you of some of the things that I have said in that book. Can you hear me well? If you do, please wave. Okay, great, great. In 1609, a few years, around 2005 or so, I was given a talk at New Mexico, and I realized in the process of giving that talk, I realized that an anniversary was coming upon us, and that is the anniversary, which is 1609 in Spain, the 400th anniversary of the decree to expel the Moriscos from Spain. And I was wondering whether anyone was going to do anything about it, and knowing full well that it was one of the most dramatic cases of ethnic cleansing in European history prior to the 20th century. It was a tragic event of enormous proportions, and I decided to go ahead and start planning a book to try to understand and explain the significance of that event. And hence, in 2009, which is exactly the 400th anniversary of that event, I published the book, We Are All Moors. And the book is basically based on the notion that how Spain, how the Spanish monarchs, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, as they tried to unite their kingdoms and in fact unify the Iberian Peninsula, chose to finish with the question of the Moor in 1492 and expel the Jews out of Spain and create what in effect is a Spanish national identity that is based on the unity of faith, which is the Catholic faith in this case, and of course Spanish language, the Castilian language. The Castilian grammar was published in the same year, 1492, and of course, imperial ambitions to accompany these national ambitions, which is to say, having a united nation with one ideology and one language, ready to spread the message of Spain conquer the world, and of course, conquer beat Muslims as well and recapture Jerusalem. Not to forget that one of the primary reasons why Queen Isabella championed, or at least permitted Christopher Columbus to undertake his voyage, is the recapture of Jerusalem. And so the conquest of America, or the discovery of America, however you want to see it, was from the very beginning tied to the global mission of defeating Muslims in Jerusalem. And so that event, between 1492 to 1609, the Moors, or the Moriscos, who, as you say, the Muslims who converted to Catholicism lived precariously among the Christians and suffered increasing persecution and tremendous pressure from the Inquisition for them to basically leave the country until Philip III in 1609 ceded to the demands and pressures placed on him and decreed the expulsion of the Moriscos. It was an operation that took about 4 or 5 years. Basically the removal of 3% of Spain's population. It involved a variety of European armies, and then, of course, and they dispersed the Moriscos around the Mediterranean. Some went even to Spain, and some went other parts of Europe. But basically, it was an incredible operation. That operation, what I was thinking as I was listening to the discussion about what to do with 12 million illegal immigrants in the United States, I kept going back to that episode in history. And I thought that I'm talking about 2006, when George W. Bush was president of the United States. I will read passages from my book to illustrate what I'm saying. And I thought maybe that episode was behind us. I kept thinking, how would they be able to deport 12 million people from the United States back into Mexico, or other Latin American countries, or whatever other countries they came from? And so it was an incredible lesson going back to 1609. Understanding what happened then was an incredible lesson for me. And I think as I go back to the book and as I shall read to you very shortly, as I'm trying to think about what's happening today, and I cannot help but see tremendous amounts of parallelisms or parallel histories and episodes and events with that period. I also want to mention, as a preface, so to speak, that even though we live in very turbulent times today. Of course, if you try to overcome or look beyond your partisan ideological views of the world right now, which is, the United States is sharply divided between the left and the right, or between Democrats and Republicans, and maybe there are 3 factions now if you add the current administration. But people have extremely strong feelings, and they think and they tend to believe their partisan views of things, whatever it is they believe in, is probably the solution, but not the other positions that are being held by rivals and by opponents. I think we have entered what we might roughly call a chaotic or turbulent period in history. Number one, as I said in 2009 in my book, we're witnessing the decline of the hegemony of the white populations around the globe. I mean, since 1492, with the conquest of Granada, and for 500 years, there was an ascendancy of the European. The Europeans came to dominate the world stage. They occupied most of the world's territories, and they exercised their influence in incredibly powerful ways. I wrote about some of the consequences of this hegemonic world rule in my book. For example, Freedom and Orthodoxy was published in 2004. And so what we are witnessing now is a moment of reversal of this powerful ethnic group, if you will, that has dominated the world for 500 years. And so the anxiety that's accompanying this reversal is manifest in a variety of ways, in the rise of nationalist movements, both in Europe and the United States, and of course, huge inequalities in the distribution of wealth. Gated communities are now the prototype of the architectural style of advanced capitalist societies. And we're watching also utter confusion and collapse of the South. It's not that the South is the holder of virtues that are not available to northern peoples, but even southern states and southern peoples and southern nations in a complete state of disarray. That's why I'm saying I need to mention this before I proceed, because we need to go beyond the notion that there is a villainous West or a villainous imperialist North and a virtuous, well-meaning, more humane or human South. I think all people, the world in its entire, the entire world now is caught up in a sort of tornado of sorts, really, and that we don't have the theoretical tools to come to terms with this in a very efficient manner. Having said this, we can try to shed some light on what is not working currently in some of the policies that are being advanced by the government of the United States or some political parties in Europe about the other, whether the other is the Muslim or the Hispanic or the Mexican or other types of people as well. I mean, these are just a couple of examples. And I think this is the tragedy of our times. It's not easy to solve, and I'm hoping that this forum or this conference would be the beginning of that process. So let me read some passages to you from my book, just to give you a sense, and then comment on some of them. So let's see. In 2006. George W. Bush gave a talk in Orange County, California, addressing a group there and about the difficulty of deporting 12 million illegal aliens. And he said, this is unrealistic. It's not going to happen to work. You can hear people out there hollering, it's going to work. It's not going to work. But what's remarkable about his statement is that people, even in 2006, were saying exactly the same things that you heard in the recent presidential election, what to do with these immigrants. So it's not necessarily a one candidate's view of the world. It is a persistent pattern in American political discourse. And you could see, just to... And then you could see, as nations are stumbling over one another to sign free trade agreements, fences and boundaries, both real and digital, are being mounted on the fault line separating poverty and wealth to maintain the fiction of national essences. The truth is that the edges of privilege are being militarized within and between nations as gated communities and other exclusive housing schemes dot the global landscape to keep the approaching hordes of barbarians at safe distances. And saying to think that displays of militant chauvinism are an answer to the question of legal and illegal immigration in a world marked by massive social inequities, or that nativist crusades against trespassers and those who are different could preserve the elusive identities we imagine for ourselves, is simply to delay the day of reckoning and aggravate the fallout from the clashes still lying ahead. There is no reason to believe that the forced exclusion of minorities will lead to the unity and stability imagined by national purists or scheming politicians. Because in Spain, that unity never was realized. And excluding, of course, minorities and from one's nation doesn't necessarily lead to the kind of prosperous lifestyle that people imagine to have for themselves. For example, the financial crisis of 2008 had absolutely nothing to do with immigrants, and yet people continue to blame immigrants for whatever ills they think their nation is suffering. And then of course, in this book that's behind me, I talk about the case of Muslims, the relationship between Muslims and Jews, Muslims and African Americans, Muslims and Latinos and Hispanics. And there are enough studies, as you know, in American history to show that nativism runs through like a mighty stream through America, through the veins of America in the United States. There are periodic eruptions of groups who want to defend America from foreign influences, whether it's foreign immigrants, whether the foreign is the Irish or the Catholic, or in the 20th century, the communists, and nowadays we have Muslims and so on. And we also had cases against the Asiatics, the Asians, the Chinese, and so on. So the American history is replete with attempts to block the coming of foreign influences onto American soil. All of these efforts, of course, have not been very successful. They have been successful to some extent, but of course, you know, the United States is becoming more diverse by the day, and demographers are telling us that soon it will be a truly diverse society, and that those pillars of the Anglo-Saxon identity that have been praised or highlighted by people like Samuel Huntington and others like him, or Patrick Buchanan, for example, are no longer applicable today. Protestantism has lost its significance, and nowadays people talk about Christianity, for example, not Protestants versus the Catholics. And so if you're talking about Christianity today, so what does it do to people who live across the border in Mexico and other states? So you cannot use religion against such people. And so you have to resort to other ways, to other forms of demonization to keep them away. And of course, even if you invoke Christianity today, we're not talking about the literally white Christianity that prevailed only 50 years ago. We have recent statistics are showing us that the vast majority of the world's Christians is going to be non-white, and it's already non-white in many parts of the globe. So Christianity has lost its white color. The Protestantism that was the pillar of the Anglo-Saxon model of government and cultural practice is no longer a powerful force in America today. And so the arguments that had been used only for 100 years or so do not apply anymore. So what then should we make of statements, nationalist statements about preserving America's core, excluding others who do not want to fit in the culture, and so on and so forth? It's a very good question, but as I said before, this is a question that only indicates the anxieties and the failures. It doesn't show anything of substance. I will, I will read something from this book again just to give you a sense. Times certainly are changing. In the world, Niall Ferguson, he's a conservative guy, as you know, outlines what looks like an inevitable future of a declining Western empire, rising Asian powers, and global demographic shifts that will make the Muslim presence in Europe an incontrovertible fact. Such ethnic confluence, economic volatility, and empires on the wane are the fatal formula that often lead to atrocities against alien groups. No historian of the 20th century, Ferguson warns, can overlook this huge and ongoing secular shift. End of quote. Similar scenarios with different outcomes are envisaged by James Kurth, the Claude Smith Professor of Political Science at Swarthmore College, who foresees Europe and the United States breaking down into at least two civilizations, one of besieged, isolated Europeans and Anglos, the other of violent Muslims and Latinos. And you could see that it is already happening today. And, so the Muslims and the Latinos, the Mexicans, but also the Latinos as a whole, occupy this very interesting place in this Euro-American sphere for different reasons. But when you look very closely, the reasons are not really very convincing. It's only because they are different and they carry a different cultural baggage with them. Perhaps it is sufficient to say that by their mere presence in Europe and the United States, Muslim and Hispanics are asserting their rights in a globally distorted economy, one that continues to favor the conquistador nations and marginalizes the conquered. Some of you have seen the film, Sergio Arau's film, A Day Without a Mexican, about the panic that seizes California when its entire Latin population vanishes for a day is a comic reminder that that xenophobic bravado is bad for the economy and the strength of the society anti-immigrants want to defend. With the economy in a shambles and upper middle class gringos left to fend for themselves, the absence of Mexicans in California leads even the most hardened nativists to reconsider their stance. By the time the Mexicans reappear, the Border Patrol agents are so grateful that they hail the first illegal immigrants they catch as heroes. And of course, illegal immigrants are very good for the economy. They contribute more than they receive in services and so on. Its same idea was expressed by the Moroccan novelist and social commentator Tahar Benjelloun in 2 years later in a book called Le Dernier Immigré, or The Last Immigrant. And there he says the same thing. France gets rid of its Arab population only to find out that they cannot do it by themselves, that their language has been deprived of many words of Arab origin or of Arabic origin. And of course, so then you have the president of France going to television to give a speech and saying Assalamu alaikum, the typical greeting in the Islamic world. So these fantasies of exclusion, this idea that by removing the undesirables or the illegal alien from the body politic, by doing that we can reconstitute ourselves as a stronger nation, a better nation, is a fantasy that has been with us for at least in the way I'm looking at it, since the 15th century. And it continues to generate the same kind of problems, the suffering and pain, tremendous amounts of violence, and of course it leads to genocide. Not to forget, that it was Spain again, that in the 15th century, prior to expelling the Jews in 1492, they instituted what's called the Statute of the Limpieza de Sangre, the purity of blood statute, in order to discriminate against or to prevent conversos, Jews who had converted to Catholicism, from occupying high-level positions in government and elsewhere. So in doing so, they blended race with religion. We're not talking about the scientific racism of Nazi Germany of 20th century Europe, but they created for the first time a template that fused, religious belief with race. And that statute remained in the books till the 19th century. It's very interesting to know. It was Spain also that created the first concentration camp in modern history in Cuba, and it was Spain that created also the notion of a nation state built on the backs of, at the expense of, minorities like the Jews or like the Moors. And the chapter in my book in which I talk about this issue of Spain in the 15th and 16th century, through the 17th centuries, I call it pious cruelty, because I was quoting Machiavelli. Machiavelli, by looking at King Ferdinand of Spain, he thought this guy was a very astute man. He's very smart. He's trying to create a sense of unity among very disparate provinces in Spain. And so he uses the excuse of the Moor to do it, and then in the name of religion too. So he defined, Machiavelli described King Ferdinand's policy as one of pious cruelty. This is one of the most ironic statements that I know of, because Machiavelli is if anything, is known for his realism, but he saw through the deceptions and the machinations of King Ferdinand and called it as such. And I think it is that's why I go back to the Moor. The Muslim has been the quintessential other in Christian European history from the moment Islam appeared on the scene of history. So even the idea of Europe in the 8th century, Europenses, the name was first used by a Spanish priest following the Battle of Poitiers in France in 732, I think. And he called the people who fought the Muslims Europeans or Europenses. And so it's the idea of a Europe that is separate from something else that began to slowly emerge in history, and its other was by definition the Muslim. Although the Jews, when I talk about the Jews have been part and part, were seen as related to Muslims for the longest time, and that they were seen as inseparable from Muslims. Actually, every time the First Crusade, before people embarked on the First Crusade to Jerusalem, they started with the Jews at home. They massacred the Jews at home because they were seen as related to Muslims. And there's a whole literature about this, and I have a whole chapter devoted to it, explaining that relationship. That relationship persisted all the way to the middle of the 20th century in the concentration camps of Nazi Germany, when the worst of the inmates in those camps were named by the Nazis Musulmans, which is Muslims. And there was a very interesting way to name them, and there has been some discussion about why they called the most debilitated Jews in the concentration camps Muslims. It's another subject that's worth looking at. But the relationship, the affinity of Jew and Muslim was very strong until the creation of the State of Israel changed everything else. But that's a topic for another day. But what I'm saying, and then of course, in the United States, for the longest time, there was a close connection between the Moor and African Americans. First of all, as we know, many slaves were of Muslim origin. I don't know, I forget the percentages. They're not a huge percentage, but a significant percentage of slaves who came from West Africa, especially those who came from West Africa, were of Muslim heritage. And we have very interesting episodes of American presidents trying to redeem or an African slave and send them back to Morocco, thinking they are because they are Moors. They used to call slave Moors. They thought they were Moroccans. Of course, they were not Moroccans. Interesting episodes in American history, and that connection with Islam between African Americans or people of African origin, Islam persisted till the present day. You could see it in movements like Malcolm X's movements, or you could in the Nation of Islam, which Malcolm X was a member. Eventually, he broke away from them. You could see it in some rap music today, and so on and so forth. There was always that connection that the Moor and that African Americans had some connection to Moorish civilization, and of course, as you just said, it's true of people of Spanish descent or people who have some Spanish descent, whether they're in Mexico, in Southwest United States, or in other parts of Latin America. I used to go to Mexico many times. Even in New Mexico, for example, was discovered by, the media called me to say something about Esteban, or Estebanico, the African American Moroccan, the black Moroccan who came with the conquistadors, who was first landed in Florida, who was the first one to discover New Mexico. And so it's interesting histories. They are marginalized histories, or maybe they are obscure histories, but they do testify to that connection between the Moor and various minority groups in Western history. Having said this, as I said before, I don't want us to think that the Moor is somehow the hero of the story. When we talk about immigration policies in the United States or in Europe, and when we complain about Islamophobia, or some people complain about migrophobia, or that kind of thing. I mean, on the other side complains about migrophobia, the other one complains about Islamophobia. When we complain about Islamophobia, that shouldn't obscure the fact that immigration policies are more dehumanizing in Muslim majority nations than they are in the West. And for example, one cannot be a citizen of most Arab nations today. It's nearly impossible. You could, but you have to go through a tremendous lot. And in some countries, it's nearly impossible. You have generations of Palestinians living in Kuwait or Saudi Arabia or Qatar or other places, they have never been nationalized. They have never been adopted as citizens of those countries. The modern notion of citizenship doesn't apply. So there is a double standard at play too. When the Muslims in Europe, or when the refugees who go to Europe, seeking refuge in Europe, complain about the lack of hospitality and so on and so forth, we don't seem to pay attention to the even more horrible treatment of their fellow Arab and Muslim nations in the Middle East, who don't even care, don't even open the doors to them the way at least the Europeans are trying to. Some countries do. Jordan is good. Morocco is reasonable. But most other countries are very, very restrictive about their about their treatment of refugees and especially immigrants. So it is a conundrum. It is a conundrum for me. It's how then, who is the hero of this story, of this tragedy, basically? I can't see any. Of course, the victims we know are the refugees, the collateral damage of the global capitalist system, the people who try to cross into the United States, the people who try to cross into Europe, the people who try to cross oceans into Europe and die and drown in the process. But then those people are leaving dysfunctional states. They live in states that give them no human rights whatsoever. And so that's why I want us to think, even though the global capitalist system has caused tremendous damage, has shaped the world in very unsustainable ways, and has caused a tremendous amount of suffering, beginning with the genocidal policies against Native Americans in 1492, leading all the way to the present, and the present policies have created fences to block Mexicans from coming into the United States, and so on and so forth. But there are even more questions. I mean, then how do we make the world a better place for all, for the people who are coming into the United States, for people who want to, for the refugees, and that is the question that is facing us and confronting us today. I don't think I have a good answer to that. What I'm doing since I published this book, and I wrote the book Islam, Islam in America, I have turned my attention to a critical reading of the Islamic tradition, because I am just personally tired of people always complaining about the West. I mean, we all know that the West has committed tremendous atrocities, but oppression is a universal practice. I mean, dehumanization can be practiced by anybody. And as I said, in Muslim majority nations where there are very few human rights, there are very few, women have very little rights, and other minorities as well. In most of them, if you're not Muslim, you're a second-class citizen. And so we need to pay attention, even as we criticize and we condemn the malpractices or the dehumanizing language of a class of politicians in the West. We need at the same time to remember that our native societies, wherever we come from, or the kinds of southern states or southern nations, have also a share of the blame. We need to hold them accountable for not doing well with their people, for not taking care of their people, for pursuing bourgeois lifestyles that mean nothing to the vast majority of the peoples in their countries. And I think it is this dual critique critique can now only be dual or multiple, if you will. But and so it is only in this fashion that we probably can connect with all the progressive movements in Africa, in Latin America, Asia, Europe, and the United States, and challenge the global economic and political systems that have created tremendous divisions and separated peoples and nations, and have led us a path that could easily cause, that can easily have catastrophic consequences. I don't want to be, I don't want to depress you on this beautiful evening, probably in Lafayette, but I think we are being, I feel, I'm just speaking to you openly, I feel like we are being called upon to think very seriously about the condition of the world today without prior prejudices, if we can help it, without our commitments to ideas that we held 10 years ago or 15 years ago, but to look at the world as it is today and think about what kind of future we want for this world. And I think it's a very mighty task. And even divisions of the South and the North, East and West have become slightly meaningless because when we now, predictions are in 20 years from now, the economies of China, Brazil, maybe Russia, maybe some other nations would outstrip the G7, the economies of the G7 nation, so-called G7 club. So economically, the world is also changing, and we don't know, but by and large, the uneven development is still the norm because it is always the logical outcome of a capitalist system that doesn't pay attention to human dignity, to the welfare of human beings, and of course the preservation of an increasingly endangered planet. So I'll stop here and see if you have any questions. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, the heroes are the ones who are fighting for social justice, basically. And I think, but for example, in the case of Native Americans, as you well know, Bartolomeo de las Casas, who dedicated his life to representing and defending the indigenous peoples who are deemed by some in Spain as less than human. And so he is the guy from a man of the church, a man of the cloth, who had he just got a spiritual awakening of sorts, an intellectual awakening, and began to see through the deceptions or the hypocrisies of his own cultural traditions. There are many. I mean, I don't think there is someone. It's interesting. I can't think of someone who's comparable to Bartolomeo de las Casas in the Anglo-Saxon tradition in America. He looms very large. His presence is just. His impact was huge, and he wrote defending at a time when Native Americans were not taken very seriously or viewed in the same terms that Europeans were. So I think sometimes you find elements in the, let's say, in some religious tradition, in this case the Catholic tradition or the Dominican tradition, that are very admirable. You get hints of this in Pope Francis today. You see some of that attempts to be more progressive, peace-loving, and trying to open up. But I don't think, I cannot think of heroes. I think of victims. I think of people who have been victimized. And those who are victimized, they spend the rest of their lives complaining about their victimhood, and they cannot get away from that sense of victimhood. Many years ago, I had a friend who now lives in New Mexico. He was a dean of my college. Actually, he was a dean who hired me, and I was giving a talk or saying something in a meeting, and he told me people are not paying. Somebody was not paying attention. And I said, why? And he said something, it sounds funny, but it's kind of stayed with me. He said, that person is too busy licking his wounds. And, once you are in that state, if you are too busy licking your wounds, if you spend the rest of your life doing it because you feel you have been aggrieved or you have been mistreated, or you have been robbed or persecuted, whatever it is. It's a self-defeating approach, because you cannot get out of that and begin to see, take a look at the larger picture, think of things that are not necessarily directly connected to you in some way or another, and begin to have a more of a universal or more of a global humanistic outlook. And that is the problem, for example, in the Arab and Islamic world today. People, I mean, they have spent decades complaining about their grievances, while the economies and the social structures, educational systems, medical establishments have been neglected in a complete state of decay. We gotta build, it's better now to build something that helps someone in our nation than to spend decades of our lives complaining about the other. And that's why I recently wrote something about Edward Said and his notion of Orientalism. And I think it was, while at that time Edward Said's notion was useful and was in some ways enabling, and it allowed people to make sense of a global cultural system, if you will, but it led over time to this sense of grievance, over which what people couldn't overcome. You know, they're in a constant state. They get stuck in a state where they're constantly the victims, looking, trying to find the villainous other. And that is my fear. My fear is, if we do not deploy our intelligence, our knowledge to create solutions that work for our people, and not necessarily to combat or to fight back or to prove a point to those who do not like us. I really don't care about those who don't like us anymore. You know, I just want to build something that works for us, whatever the us is. Yes, that's you know, no, I mean, the quick answer is I cannot give you a good example right now. You know, I think we are in bad shape. I think if we live in a world where 1% of the population controls at least 3/4 of the global wealth, or at least I mean, that's a recipe for trouble and violence and doomsday scenarios down the road. I mean, I don't know how that could be sustainable, but I also do not know how to get away from this economic model. I don't know. It requires something. I don't think anyone is talking about it today. There was a time, but that time has long passed, when socialism, communism, not the Soviet-style communism, but some form of communism, was at least something that certain European countries considered. Only 30 years ago, as you recall, you know, every European country, or most of them, had a sort of respectable communist party. In Italy, in France, in Spain, but they have gone. There's no one there. So that's why we begin to see the eruption of extremism, religious extremism. I mean, Olivier Roy, for example, the French Islamic scholar, talks about this. He says there's no one left to represent the working classes and proletariat in France anymore. There's no communist left. There's no communist party to do that. So now what we have is the imams or the jihadis are filling in that gap with their crazy sermons and with their promise of you know, paradise and so on and so forth. So it's the working classes, the excluded, the lumpen proletariat have no one to defend them in the Western economic systems today. And the only people who seem to speak for them, as you know now, are the nationalist movements. Nationalist movements in the United States, in France, in Hungary, increasingly in the Netherlands, even though hasn't gained that kind of momentum yet. But Brexit, you see that, and so it has become somewhat of a trend because there's no one to defend the working classes, the people who gravitate towards nationalism, not exclusively, but for the most part, are the working classes or the lower middle classes who do not have anyone to represent or defend their interests. So they think that they're being failed by their governments, by the economic systems. I wish I could answer the question. I wish I had a model to present, but I can't think of one. I cannot think of one. I mean, I could say the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a good document to go by, or you could say that human rights organizations are doing their best, but I don't see how. For example, if you talk about human rights, the Declaration of Human Rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948, for example. I mean, half of that declaration deals with the right to work, the right to education, the right to housing, the right, and so on and so forth. When politicians nowadays talk about human rights, they only use it in the sense of politics, the right to free expression, the right to political views. But no one ever talks about the right to economic security, the right to work, the right to housing, the right to medical care, the right. So in that sense, the United States, unfortunately, is a country, it's a society, it's a nation where human rights are very deficient. I mean, most of the human rights as outlined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights do not apply yet in this society, and they do not apply in many other societies that are considered to be democratic, and they seem to care a lot about human rights. Unfortunately, I'm not happy with my answers, but unfortunately I don't. I think monotheistic religions are part of the problem. The differences among the narcissism of small differences. I mean, in a way, they have much in common, but they also have a lot that's they also have much that is different. At least in the way they imagine themselves, their identities, their theologies. For example, if you look at religions from a historical perspective, you'd find that Christianity would be a variation on Judaism and Islam a variation on both. So that is the easiest and simplest historical way to explain the three major monotheistic religions. But but religions are defined negatively. What I mean by that is to be a Muslim, you absolutely cannot be Christian or Jew. To be a Jew, you cannot be Christian or Muslim. And so those differences, that emphasis on one's difference it's heightened and emphasized to such a point that it makes the other, the Jew or the Christian, the enemy or the kafir or the second-class citizen in a Muslim polity. For example, people who talk about a Sharia nation, the Sharia in Islam, they say, of course, yeah, we accept Jews and Christians, but what they don't say is as second-class citizens or worse. So it's like they're not equal to Muslims in that hierarchy. And so, for example, today, as we speak, the vast majority of Muslim majority nations, definitely of Arab nations, which is stretching from Mauritania all the way to Iraq, they all have constitutions that state unequivocally that Islam is the official religion of the state. And so if you are a Christian or a Jew in those countries, you cannot be head of state. You can occupy some middle management function, if you will, but you cannot be head of the state. And including Iraq and Afghanistan, whose constitutions were drafted after the invasion of 2003 and with the support and help of some legal experts from the United States. They couldn't do it. The United States, America was able to separate religion from public office in the late 18th century in 1780, in the Constitution of 1787, and in the Muslim world today, it still cannot be done. And so I think that is an issue. That is an issue that is not very often debated in the media in the West, because we try to be respectful and we try to be sensitive to other cultural traditions. But I think monotheism in Muslim majority nations today, for example, is a huge problem. It is a huge problem because it excludes everything else. You cannot be secular. You cannot change your religion in many cases. It is a crime against the state. You cannot change religions. That means you're an apostate, and the punishment for that in some cases can be death, and so on and so forth. So that when I said that the conditions in some of these countries from which the Moors originally came is deplorable, it's really bad, and I think religion, in my view, and I know this is a very sensitive issue, in my view, religion has outlived its usefulness. In my view, it was good for a time, for a period of time, but in the 21st century, with modern science, with all the things we do nowadays, to think that we can define ourselves by ideas and theologies that were concocted, that were in 2,000 years ago or 5,000 years ago, doesn't seem to make a lot of intellectual sense. But I can understand the emotional attachment to them. So I think religions should also be open to investigation and critical analysis, and whether they're still suitable vehicles for identification and identity formation. That's my view about religions. I think the problem in the West, in the United States, in Western Europe, religion is separated from governance. It's separated from culture. It's separated from a lot of things that happen at the social level. But in other countries, it's not separated. It's inseparable, and that is the problem, as we continue to see in current events today. I hope I have answered your question. I think that the model should be, to me, is the American system, the American Republican system, where you have the separation of state, of government, state, and religion. It ought to be a universal model, like it is in Europe in many cases, but in other parts of the globe, it's still not the case, and it's a problem, and it's a huge infringement on the rights of the non-Muslims, for example. That is a very good question. It reminds me, I mentioned the fact when George W. Bush was in 2006 was trying to address the thorny issue of illegal immigration, and eventually Congress came up with a law that was heavily contested by huge demonstrations. Remember, it's HR something, I forget the name of that law, and the law failed. But then you had, I think it was a senator from Oklahoma, not from Oklahoma, or from Hawaii, I cannot remember, who introduced a bill in Congress to make English the official language, to make the official language of the United States. So periodically, accompanying this anxiety over, or this panic, Hispanic as somebody called it, the anxiety over Mexican or Spanish immigrants, Spanish-speaking immigrants in America, in the United States, this panic is always accompanied by attempts to make English the official language of the country in most places. So it's very interesting how language is connected to these imperial or nationalistic ambitions. You see it happening in France too. The French are very jealous and very of their national heritage. They want to keep it away from Anglo influences, English influences, so they mandate all kinds of things to protect their French heritage, including their French language. So yes, language is always attached to national ambitions, to ideas of nationalism. And on the other hand, you'd have Mexicans or Latinos they'd use the Spanish language to make a point about their national identity and about their heritage. So it's, yes, languages play an interesting role, and it is, it is very interesting. When I was researching that book, I discovered that increasingly in states like, I don't know how it is in Louisiana, but in Texas and other places, that the number one names were Spanish names. They like not John or David, but they were like, I can't remember what they were, like, but they were Spanish names. And even if you looked at the last presidential election, I was in Morocco the day after the election commenting on television about the election. I was in Paris when it was happening live, and then Morocco that same day in the evening commenting on the outcome. And people were calling America racist. They said, "Oh, well, it is racism that's back in the United States." I said, "Well, wait a second. The most prominent candidates of the Republican ticket, one was African American, two were Latinos, and one is Donald Trump. So that is an incredible, if you remember this, that is very different from what happened 50 years ago. Does it make a difference? Has ideology now obscured people's ethnic origins? So now we don't seem to be saying a lot about this fact. Two Latinos, one African American, and Donald Trump, a man of German descent. And Germany at one time in American history was considered also undesirable, and Germans were considered undesirable, especially after the First World War, the Huns. And if you look at immigration policy and America's attitude towards the Germans, same thing. So what's interesting is, I think the change has become almost imperceptible, that we had 4 out of the top candidates of the Republican Party, 3 of them are not Anglos. Only one is considered probably an Anglo, Donald Trump. And yet that hasn't somehow led to an interesting conversation about the changes that are happening in American culture and society. But it's happening. What we're paying attention to now is ideology. Because they're associated with the Republican Party, their ethnic diversity, whatever it is, doesn't seem to make a difference. And the other thing is, the other thing that I want to mention is about Obama. Obama was elected twice. I keep reminding people outside of the United States that a person like Obama would only be elected in the United States. For some, he would never have been elected in Kenya, for example. It's just what it is. Sometimes the irony of these kinds of democracies is you get these kinds of outcomes. But what I'm saying is, yes, the question of language is very interesting. German at one time, early in the early days of the Republic, the Mark Schell wrote a wonderful piece about this. I recommend it very highly. German was almost going to sort of trump the English language in the early days of the Republic. But Benjamin Franklin was paying attention to German. But eventually, and for the longest time, German was considered to be absolutely close to English in significance until the First World War. And things changed dramatically for German. And Mexicans now, Mexican or Spanish, I don't know what's going to happen with that. But I think language is a very good subject to pursue, a topic to pursue, as we try to make sense of this fast-changing landscape of, demographic landscape and cultural reality. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Okay. Bye-bye.